Coming to you live, but not really. It is all pomp and no circumstance with Ryder Richards on LetUsThinkAboutIt.com, the amateur hour you should never tune into.
Hello and welcome back. This is Ryder Richards with Let Us Think About It. Okay, so the first few minutes, we're going to get a bit of a roadmap on where this podcast has been heading. And this is, of course, as you might know, kind of a DIY class I have invented for myself to better understand how to understand. And I think this whole first year, we're primarily doing what Eve Sedgwick would call paranoid reading. This is versus reparative reading. So paranoid reading is kind of a way to understand the world when the world is confusing and you're sort of finding armor and arguments that will work for you. But increasingly, we're going to start looking more for solutions. And so I'm going to be supplementing back in more reparative reading. And now that's the kind of reading that will help you connect with the world, rebond us to the world. So the purpose of our reading will start to become a little more mixed, and that can be a little bit more fun for us. So as usual, if you like the show, please take a minute to rate, review, and hop on the website, LetUsThinkAboutIt.com. Of course, you can contribute. You can also leave a simple comment. Let us know what you like or don't like. I haven't combed my hair in 2 days, so anyone watching the video, feel free to comment on that. Yeah, right on. Part 1. One reason that we need to get into Baudrillard and all of his radical ideas is that so far, almost every book we've looked at has shown a disconnect between what we're actually told, what is real here now, and what is actually happening. Most philosophy, of course, does this, often trying to stitch together kind of a framework for how to think or handle the world around us, how to filter these ideas, and they sort of try to build a model, and hopefully this model is better than the previous model. That way we're always progressing into a better future with better models. However, sometimes these models break down. So when we read Michael Sandel's The Tyranny of Merit, we see that education doesn't really do what it's supposed to do. Instead of making the world more just and equitable, it tends to make the world into just another nepotistic aristocracy. So roughly half the population ends up being squashed, while a small percentage of the rich tend to thrive. So we would assume that this is a broken model in need of reform. Of course, we also read Moral Mazes by Robert Jackal, and he talks a lot about corporations and what it takes to thrive and survive in them. And we see that morality and virtues can actually be a hindrance in a company. Of course, it depends on which kind of virtues we're talking about here. But they want corporate loyalty from people who can mask their sociopathy. Each person must, of course, act for their own best self-interests. And of course, you have to, along the way, claim it's for the company. So it's really all about the optics and perception. It's fakery. So people weaponize social belonging to be a team player in order to get a consensus effect, right? They fake friendship for political leverage. The companies also, of course, privatize the gains for a few small individuals while socializing the risks across the nation. And of course, they damage the world along the way, but who cares, right? No one's going to be held accountable for it. So anyway, the same sentiments are also found in Richard Sennett's The Culture of the New Capitalism. Oh boy. Where we see that social stability that we once had, that it came out of the military's pyramidal hierarchy, this bureaucracy, this has been sacrificed to recreate the anxiety of instability. And we see this across the world now. We purposely stripped away the stable futures, and we have returned to the fear and survival from several hundred years ago. And somehow we've done all this and managed to also disconnect people from community and purpose. Lovely, right? And almost everything now is, of course, marketed. Or, as he says, gold-plated, which is sort of being superficial to such an extreme that value becomes divorced from reality. So the use value of something, utilitarian value, matters less than the appearance value or the social capital. This is just crazy. And in such a shallow world, the workers can no longer even voice their desires when asked a question, much less articulate a way into a stable future. They have no model that allows a predictable, beneficial future for them. Now, of course, all these problems have been revealed to us over the last 20 to 40 years, and yet we don't see any major efforts to improve or correct them. We see that the world has basically lost its ability to maintain human interest at its center. Yeah, human desires? Wait. Yeah, we got that. We enhance and manufacture those. But the actual thriving of humans long term? Yeah, that's been stripped away. And we're now left with dominant corporations and even machines that pretend to be human. While humans are, of course, filled with anxiety and fear, blanketed by desire for commodities. So maybe we should give some, more radical ideas a chance here, even if they were written 30 or 40 years ago, seeing as all these classical virtues, the sort of common sense of our parents and grandparents, they only tend to entrench us further into getting abused. Adam Curtis. He has mentioned that historically, social change happens when chaos or breakdown occurs. For example, in the 1920s, the Depression, then people looked around for ideas to fix the system because, of course, we didn't want this broken model getting any further broken. And we had the public works that ended up improving the country. Yay, socialism! And, of course, we had the restructuring of the Fed. Now, where did those ideas come from, right? These things that made America great again. Well, that's a good question, Ryder, and of course, it's actually not my question. But these were developed and argued and hashed out over the 15 to 20 previous years by passionate intellectual citizens. So, when the chaos did come, when the model broke down, well, there was a ready alternative to reach for. We already had fresh ideas to fix the previous mistakes. We had new models to replace the broken models. And we want to keep improving along this sort of trajectory or path. So what happened when we had the, let's say, 2008 recession? How about the Occupy movement or the Afghanistan war? Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry, the Iraq war, this kind of false flag war. And how about any number of other chaotic events during this century and current movements, such as Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, immigration, Me Too, or perhaps an insurrection on the Capitol? And of course, we have all this chaos. Okay, Adam Curtis, where are the new ideas? And of course, Adam Curtis says, maybe we don't have any. We either have no new ideas that are strong enough to displace our current system, which, by the way, is a huge problem, meaning either we aren't coming up with any good new ideas, or those ideas are not being heard, which is actually even harder to believe in the age of the internet. So, alternately, there's also this kind of vested interest notion, where those in power are maintaining the status quo, which, of course, serves them and harms us. And once again, we're back to kings and queens and monarchies and aristocracy. And all this seems obvious, that we bailed out the companies that broke America in 2008, and then they ended up bonusing their employees millions of dollars. So, yes, we really only pay lip service to the virtues or common sense of our grandparents. And we have dismissed responsibility. Basically now, consequences fall randomly, if at all. So, we're in this new world, and we of course need to map out the values that exist here, but not so we can emulate them or even game them, right? It's really so we can move beyond them. Because I don't think sociopathy is the value system we want to take into the future with us. This is the problem with our old values. Primarily, these were, of course, Protestant work ethic values, and we keep looking backwards to this professed golden age, so we can cherry pick out the pieces of the past we want to keep. And in turn, we end up kind of romanticizing the solidarity that we find there while ignoring all the atrocities. Of course, we turn to nostalgia on the right hand, and on the left hand, we look at the arc of history, the right side of history, right? And these are loosely linked, if you'll stick with me for a moment on this. The right wants a return to an imagined mythic past that never actually existed. And of course, the left is hitching a ride to the righteous future, baby. And it's all about this kind of weaponized utopia. We're either looking backward to move forward, or we're claiming the promised land in advance. And here we encounter the danger of a politics of eternity. As mentioned by Timothy Snyder, this is basically the never-ending loop. Either the past is rehabilitated, along with all its problems, or the future is inevitable, along with its problems. Now, the problem is, when things get this big and they seem outside of our control, you tend to hear it in conversations on both sides, when people revert to phrases like, well, I can't do anything about that, I'm just gonna have to look after me and mine. This is a return to the individual, to the small tribe. And this, of course, comes from insecurity and fear. This comes from the churn. a closing down against something that's apparently too big to fight. Now, as Edward Snowden has said, we have huge, scary truths that have been handed to us on a platter, i.e. our government is illegally spying on people. Yet, for some reason, it's easier to believe in and take action on conspiracy theories, such as Pizzagate or COVID comes from 5G cell towers, because at least on an individual scale, I can chop down that 5G tower, I can attack that pizza restaurant. Now, we want to believe and fight in things we can actually impact. This is fascinating because it's human-scale thinking. These are human-scale time frames. These are small, short-term thinking problems. The thinking of individuals, not of ecosystems. This is the reduction of all things. This is individuals facing fear and instability. Now, in a more kind of Foucaultian notion, right? Panopticon, let's talk about power has increasingly made itself hard to find. We can no longer charge the king's castle with pitchforks. And since a panopticon, power has increasingly made itself more present, yet somehow more invisible, more dispersed. And somebody like Snowden or Assange, well, they get put on governmental hit lists and labeled as treasonous traitors because they unmask the truth. Which is that really there is no truth and it's only lies. They reveal power in its most terroristic form. Interestingly, Baudrillard brings up the problem with living in a reality that has lost its reference to the profound. This simulation must mask its absence of profundity or true purpose. So, for instance, a little thought experiment. Maybe we can just talk through this so it's not all abstractions. If you were to, let's say, simulate a bank robbery, perhaps as a ill-conceived art performance to show that capital is just an abstraction, it's all digital and banks don't even have money anymore. Well, for the simulated robbery to make the point, it needs to appear so real that it will get an actual response, a real response from the real world. And at that point, the intention behind the robbery actually ceases to matter because the act itself becomes indiscernible from a real actual robbery. So the better your simulation, the less your ideals matter. And this can be positive or negative, right? So if you survive, right, if you survive your simulation that looks like a real robbery and say you don't get shot by a crazy Texan for your brazen attempt to reveal the truth, that really there is no money, or how all property is false property anyway, and that's an artificial concept. Well, I mean, so let's say you do make it to court. Do you think they will be more or less lenient on you than a real robber, right? These are real-world effects for your simulation. I would actually imagine that you're more dangerous than a real robber, and that you will be punished more harshly because your actions actually undermine the social order to a larger extent. While kind of in a negative or an inverse sense, the real robbers actually uphold the system. They keep proclaiming that life is worth money. They actually believe in money and its power, and that only reinforces a predominant current simulation. They will always be seen as somehow more sane and more controllable than people who reveal, however briefly, that the simulacra or simulation is at play. Thus, somebody like Snowden, treasonous traitor, and yet storming the White House is just something the GOP thinks we should just forget. Just let's put this behind us and move on. Now, why would that be? Because, in the most cynical sense possible, gullible citizens are upholding the simulacra. They will continue to uphold a broken social contract and storm the castle or do whatever a leader tells them to do. This means they are controllable, manipulable, and thus these are valuable citizens. Those who actually reveal the absence, the void, beneath all of these power games, they trigger an immunological reaction. This is an abreaction. The entire social contract can come crashing down with these heretical ideas. These people, they're a virus in the simulation, and they must be eradicated. Part 2. Little story about Baudrillard and simulacrum. So let's start with this little story that happened to me maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, in which I went to an art talk of a friend of mine, and of course we're all just sitting around clacking our tongues, and then finally the artist gets up to speak, right? Her painting, well, it's a quote painting, right? And it's actually just a rectangle on the wall, and it's actually made out of printed out pictures of paint. So she took photos of paint, then printed them out, and then pasted them onto the rectangle, kind of chopped up, right? So it seems kind of like a painting, and it sort of references painting, but it's really not made of paint, and it's not really a painting. So yeah, this is actually all quite fun, and in the art world we tend to just do these things, and it's a lot of fun, but she kept referring to it as a simulacra. Of course, me being me, I nod my head as if I knew what that meant, and I sort of thought at the time that I did. I mean, through context, it seemed like this was actually a step removed from the real thing. So maybe actually a simulation is what we're talking about here. And I think that this is, of course, what the artist was thinking too. Of course, after the talk, we walk outside, and a buddy of mine kind of leans over and says,
"That's not what a simulacra is. She was using the term wrong."
And of course, me being me, again I nodded my head and I pretended once again that I knew what the heck he was talking about, and that I knew what a simulacra was. So this is really where I think things get sticky. So the artist might have been mistaken in how she used the term. She thought she had knowledge, right? However, I was a pretender. I pretended I understood her use of the term, and then I pretended I understood what my friend meant. So in both cases, I was simulating knowledge. And that's probably worse than just being mistaken about something. Now, my buddy, during the talk, what was he doing? He was actually quite polite and not calling her out on her incorrect use of the term, which meant for a little while, at least during the talk, he was actually dissimulating. He was pretending not to know something that he clearly knew. So these are all slightly different things here. So this is a loose way to sort of showcase some of the ideas that Baudrillard talks about, because if we dig even deeper, we have to consider that the entire educational edifice, where an artist could possibly get out of school saying words like simulacra and not actually know what it means, points out that the whole system of education is actually a simulation of intelligence itself, because obviously none of her art professors had called her out on it either. And then we get into the art world, where, of course, a painting isn't actually a painting, but it's a reference to a painting. So it's a simulation of a painting. But that's really not even the point, right? What does art actually reference? What is it supposed to reference? What is its purpose? Well, kind of in a Hegelian sense, it should be pointing to the absolute. It should be somehow establishing a connection to the profound or the sacred. But what we're doing instead is merely pointing at and masking earlier versions of prior incarnations of art, and it becomes so self-referential that it loses its original purpose. And in this way, the art world becomes a simulacra of what it once was, right? It no longer even has an intent or a purpose, and there is no truth to even mask anymore. It's just running full steam into the future. And of course, we could and will argue that anything that money touches, money being, of course, the original simulacra, the original abstraction that abstracts all and simulates all desires, well, money will turn all other things into detached self-referential equivalence machines, or simulacra. So, in an art gallery, a temple of art, really, for money, during an art talk, we all nod along with the catechism. And maybe my art friend, she might have been right after all. Not only was her piece a simulacra, but anything in this context was most likely a simulacra. And how can you be raised in a simulacra, trained in a simulacra, and use that simulacra to ever truly reconnect or reveal a profound absolute? I just don't know if it's possible. How do you do that? Part 3. After the Orgy. So, yeah, Jean Baudrillard, the Transparency of Evil, Essays on Extreme Phenomenon. The first essay in here is called After the Orgy, which is just a really fantastic title. What we're going to do here is just sort of read through this. So if you don't like this kind of thing, stop, please. Don't force yourself to go through it. But on the other hand, I do kind of think that his language might help us get a better idea on how to consider these simulated worlds and these ideas that he's working through. And I really kind of like the way he writes. So we're going to just read a little bit. I'm going to comment on it a little bit. And this shouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes to kind of get through. I'm not going to read the whole darn thing anyway. So anyway, let's get rocking. The orgy in question was the moment when modernity exploded upon us. The moment of liberation in every sphere. political liberation, sexual liberation, liberation of the forces of production, liberation of the forces of destruction, women's liberation, children's liberation, liberation of unconscious drives, liberation of art. The assumption of all models of representation as of all models of anti-representation. This is a total orgy. An orgy of the real, the rational, the sexual, of criticism as of anti-criticism, of development as of crisis of development. We have pursued every avenue in the production and effective overproduction of objects, signs, messages, ideologies, and satisfactions. What do we do now that the orgy is over? Now all we can do is simulate the orgy, simulate liberation. We may pretend to carry on in the same direction, accelerate, but in reality, we are accelerating into a void. Because what haunts and obsesses us is being thus ahead of all the results. The very availability of all signs, all the forms, all the desires that we've been pursuing. The state of utopia realized, of all utopias realized, wherein paradoxically, we must continue to live as though they had not been. But since they have been, and since we can no longer therefore nourish the hope of realizing them, we can only hyper-realize them through the interminable simulation. We live amid the interminable reproduction of ideals, fantasies, images, and dreams, which are now behind us, yet which we must continue to reproduce. In a sort of inescapable indifference. Okay, so I kind of suck at dramatic reading, but whatever. This is actually why I love reading Baudrillard, though. I think the language is so great. It's so dense, right? The stakes are high. There's big sweeping claims. It's all, of course, highly arguable. But whenever I enter a conversation, I usually have to step in with a trust bias, right? I get to say yes and to get to see where this conversation goes. And eventually, though, I'll probably pull back out and mull it over and see what sticks and try it on for size. I can kind of sandbox it for a while. Now, first off, we have to remember again, this is written in 1990, and I think Simulacra and Simulation was written in 1981. So when we consider the excesses of the 80s and into the 90s, the kind of peak of stupidity we were in, you can kind of see where this language comes from. Now, he talks of this retro-making, being haunted by results that arrived before us, yet we continue to simulate the striving. This is akin to having something like more money than you know what to do with, right? It's basically having the orgy, and knowing before it even happens that it's going to be boring, yet you go ahead and do it anyway and proclaim it to be amazing. And then we go back and keep working for more of it, making more money so we can have more orgies, and then we act as if this is all vital and amazing, when it's really not. And really, what happens here is we have forgotten the purpose of money, success, sex, liberation, freedom, etc. And you're simply enacting the behaviors to simulate the fulfillment, and the end goal has been achieved before we've even showed up. Everywhere what has been liberated so that it can enter a state of pure circulation, so that it can go into orbit. The fate of things is liberated in an incessant commutation, and these things are the subject to increasing indeterminacy, to the principles of uncertainty. So basically here, to be liberated is to enter orbit. It is to be replaced repeatedly and to become so indeterminate or uncertain. Well, So wait, what did we liberate again?
I don't know, I'm free!
Well, is it good or is it bad?
We're beyond good or bad, we're free!
So what are you gonna do with your freedom there, buddy?
I'm gonna have an orgy!
Yeah, and then what?
Maybe have another orgy? A bigger orgy?
So you really just don't have a plan, do you?
We beat the communists! Take off your pants! Put stuff in your holes! Yeehaw!
Nothing, not even God, now disappears by coming to an end, by dying. Instead, things disappear through proliferation or contamination, by becoming saturated or transparent, because of extenuation or extermination, or merely as a result of the epidemic of simulation. Rather than a mortal mode of disappearance, we now have a fractal mode of dispersal. So, I found these primary ideas to be pretty profound. Not only have we achieved the goal, but it will not disappear once achieved, right? It's not like you just finish that thing and then it disappears, we must now keep pretending to achieve it over and over again, reconquering the same video game, reinventing God, reinventing holiness, right? Once we have achieved a liberation, a freedom from something, is for that thing to have transcended us, to move into orbit, only to disperse outwards. It does not disappear so much as lose contact with its original moment, having pieces of itself slowly replaced along the way or commuted, and these spread out into thinner, lighter forms, a fractal dispersal without meaning. Now, he goes on to say that this is, and by the way, this is kind of the last part I'm going to read, so you won't have to stick with this much longer.
There is no longer any such thing as a revolution of values, merely a circumvention or involution of values. A centripetal compulsion coexists with a decenteredness of all systems, an internal metastasis or fevered indigenic virulence, which creates a tendency for systems to explode beyond their own limits, to override their own logic, and in the sense of creating sheer redundancy, but in the sense of an increase in power, a fantastic potentialization, whereby in their own very existence is put at risk.
So, yeah, in the beginning, I mentioned that we live in a new world, one that needed new values. As we now pretend or circumvent values, essentially we shrink them and diminish them, and we work around them. We sort of pretend to hold on to a center, to a core of meaning or values that we often can't really place in reality. But increasingly, all things become decentered, with a sort of cancerous virulence, right? That's right under the surface there. Now, this pretending, this being decentered, wanting to spread, causes systems to explode beyond their own logic, right? This is just the tendency when you have all this sort of pent-up pressure underneath. Now, if you remember, Sennett said that once we have achieved social stability through hierarchical pyramids or bureaucracy, we just couldn't stand it anymore, and we exploded that system into the central command of an MP3 player. And what we did is sort of fractally disperse out labor to only be played one track at a time. And then at some point, even the bosses at the center, they walk away with no responsibility or authority. So we actually worked to destabilize companies so they would be more virulent, more edgy. And that actually ended up boosting their stock prices. This is this overpotentialization that he's talking about here. And this is, of course, at the cost of people. But these systems increased in power with their new destabilized value. They were shedding the baggage of serving people. They now entered orbit. They transcended us. They were free of purpose, and they dispersed globally. Now, this is only companies I'm talking about as an example for these ideas. But it happens in politics, sex, art, capitalism, criticism, rationality, and, well, pretty much just about anything else you can think about. Now, towards the end of the essay, Baudrillard says, "Art, likewise, has failed to realize the utopian aesthetic of modern times, to transcend itself and to become an ideal form of life. Instead of being subsumed in a transcendent ideology, art has been dissolved within a generalist aestheticization of everyday life, giving way to a pure circulation of images, a trans-aesthetics of banality." So, it's not art revealing the truth or the profundity. It is art as banality, art as the everyday. To champion the banal as a form of self-transcendent religion. And of course, this smacks of my story earlier, about the painting that was not really a painting, but a picture of paint. And we all gather around to pay homage. And just like this podcast or social media, we all gather around and pay attention to this artifice as if there's some sort of real knowledge in it. Communication is more social than the social itself. It is the hyper-relational sociality overactivated by social techniques. So basically, we now disperse knowledge, and we call it communication. We broadcast, we don't actually communicate. Good communication must take place fast. There is no time for silence. The silence, the occasional blip in the interminable script of our uninterrupted fiction. That might be the only meaningful revelation of the void that is beyond us. Alright, thank you for sticking with me on this one. This is really just kind of a small taste of Baudrillard, but perhaps you can see how it provides a model or a framework to analyze why things that don't make sense in a kind of a classical way actually kind of do make sense it's because our ideals and institutions have transcended us, and they're in orbit now where they don't play by the same rules or values. They become detached. And as usual, if you've enjoyed this podcast, if you learned a little bit about being detached, please reattach, please rate and review us, and of course we'd love to have you become a member, and that would just take a small donation on the website at letusthinkaboutit.com. Now next week I hope to ground us a little bit more, and eventually I want to have a kind of a physics conversation about time with a couple friends of mine. But until then, stay safe. All the best.